Welcome to the Natural Wisdom Podcast. I'm Christine Backus, your host, and I am very excited today to have Chad Woodward with me, a fellow astrologer, and we are looking forward to a very fun and interesting conversation. Hey, Chad,
Hello.
and thank you so much for joining me today. I wanted to say a couple of things before I do a proper intro for Chad. One is that, well, just date, it's Friday, September 12th. It's been a very wild week. We had an eclipse last Sunday, and then this has been a very maybe challenging week, is the best thing I can say on a cultural basis, on a worldwide basis. So I don't know that we'll be talking about that, but hopefully we'll be able to shed some light just in general on what's going on in the world through the lens of astrology. And then I did want to make one announcement, and that is that some of you will know this from my newsletters, but I've opened the doors to a solstice retreat on the weekend of the solstice in December. So it'll be December 19th through the 23rd, 3 nights, 2 full days. And the purpose of this retreat is, well, for one thing, it's truly a retreat. It's going to be held at a hot springs resort just south of Santa Fe. And it's really about integrating kind of the major transformations we've all been going through this year, and then looking ahead to new beginnings. And I'm calling it a renewal, a chance to renew your life. I just put a payment plan up on the sales page. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And of course, you can always get in touch with me if you're curious and you want to know more. But I did want to let people know um, it's going to be just my time that I've spent at the resort already getting ready and putting it together has been magical. I think it's going to be a magical time. And I can't think of a year where we need it more. So that I did want to let everybody know about that. So with that, let me give you a more proper intro, Chad, and I'm going to cheat and look at what you sent me, but I'm also going to editorialize because one of the reasons I asked you to join me today is I just had a reading with you, I think last week or the week before, and it was the first reading I'd had from another astrologer in a while, much needed, and it was just such a really wonderful experience. So Chad's a professional astrologer and founder of Cosmic Mind Astrology. I've been reading that newsletter of yours for several years now and just have always really appreciated that you take a broader and more insightful approach. And there's a lot of depth to it, which I happen to like. Um, you say nearly 20 years of experience exploring the symbolic language of the sky, um, combining psychological and evolutionary astrology. And I also know you do a lot of mundane work as well and look into the historical patterns that we're living. Um, you've worked with Stephen Forrest, and you're one of the few people I know that actually has a postgraduate degree in this field, and I did not know this existed, but cultural astronomy and astrology from the University of Wales. That's that's fascinating. I love that. We might talk a little bit about how you got into all of that. And then you have some other interests that I do as well, like cultural anthropology, cultural evolution. And then I'm going to just quote one line and then shut up and let you talk a little bit about yourself. But Chad uses astrology as a tool for navigating the interplay of choice, creativity, karma, and destiny. And then I'm going to keep going and invite clients to see beyond the materialist worldview and engage with the archetypal forces shaping their lives. And I think I'm going to ask you if there's anything you want to add to your introduction, but then I also wanted to just talk for a moment about your philosophy of astrology, because I've heard you talk about it a little bit, and I think it's great for our audience.
Yeah. So, yeah, my foundational entry into astrology was through psychological evolutionary work. And that very much emphasizes free will and choice and the participation of the client in their own decision-making capacity and even engagement with the planetary cycles. So that's very much a big part of how I came into astrology and in my professional training. Um, but also, I'm super fascinated with the way that things kind of just show up in our life that are beyond our control. And also, of course, there's just the inevitable aspects of life that are beyond our control. There are these variables that we can't necessarily do much about, other people's decisions and choices being number one, people we're in relationships with, but a lot going on in the outside world that is quite beyond our ability to shape necessarily. Although you can get into, and this is a huge part of how I see things too, is the unconscious participation. So very much a Jungian take on things. I love Jung's work in that perspective, and I think he was way ahead of his time. And I think actually a lot of what he was saying and uncovered is just now being, coming more into form in terms of innovations right now, or just new developments in philosophy and physics. And there's a lot that's conforming or confirming that there's this definite field of some kind or some unconscious layer to our reality or hidden layer to our reality that shapes our experiences. So from that point of view, um, I do think there are elements of even external experiences and things that we don't seem to have control over that are rooted unconsciously. Um, but yeah, so I try to kind of find a middle ground with things, um, trying to cover all bases, and that's why I, list the confluence of choice, creativity, karma, fate. It's this interplay of things we encounter in life, things that show up. I do think that we are meant to experience certain things at certain times in our life. That's been completely my experience. And I also do think that we have transpersonal aspects to ourselves, not just in terms of like archetypes that we see as astrologers, like the mind of Mars or the mind of the consciousness of Saturn or the archetypes of those beings coming into our life. But there's also, I believe, a transpersonal dimension to ourselves that guides us and that directs us in life. And that's definitely been my experience. And I think that's tapping into that is a really powerful, it's not easy to do, but I think as astrologers, if we can tap into that transpersonal aspect of our clients and try to get information from that, I think that's usually where I find readings are the most powerful, is when we're
Mhm.
really in alignment with that. In ancient times, that was known as the daemon, Daimon, and then later distorted into our concept of the demon or demonic and so forth. But the daemon was actually a really complex archetype because it brought both good and bad things in our life, but for our own good. So we could experience, I think, that transpersonal aspect of ourselves or transpersonal aspects of ourselves sometimes as bringing misfortune and bringing hardship and difficulty. But but I believe a lot of those experiences are actually quite valuable and shape us into who we become. So as an astrologer, I like to, sometimes you just sit with a client who's going through loss and grief and things just suck. And and the beauty of astrology is that we have the ability to see the time frame of things, so we can at least offer like, I can't fix this for you. This is what's happening. And sitting with them and validating their experience is just alone powerful, and just letting them know like this is something that you see as well. And then giving them a time frame around it, okay, this is when perhaps things will get the sky will clear, right? Um, but those experiences too, just honoring that things need to show up at certain times for people. And just in my own life, I mean, I've had some pretty difficult moments in my life, pretty traumatic things that have happened to me, and I see them, but they were just so critical to who I've become and have nudged me in very specific directions. And had I not had those experiences, many of them under Saturn transits, by the way, or Pluto transits, I don't think I would have pursued the paths that I'm pursuing now, because they just shook things up enough to wake me up to myself on a deeper level. So I don't know if that totally encapsulates my philosophy, but just kind of touches on, yeah, I think just looking at fate from a different vantage point, that it's, I think, intentionally guided. And that, I think, is part of like evolutionary work. I mean, evolutionary work goes into the idea of reincarnation. I treat it as a metaphor of sorts. I don't know really what's happening, but I've had experiences, dreams in my life that I was literally put into the body of a whole other person that I, while I was having it, knew that this was an experience I had had, and all their memories and everything. So I've had pretty profound visions like that that are undeniable for me phenomenologically, to where and the themes of those dreams were so fitting to my chart and things I've experienced in this life, and they connected deeply to struggles I have. So I do think there's a lot more too. Obviously, there's the transpersonal part of ourselves. And that's, yeah, so exploring the idea of reincarnation, past lives, past experiences, or that we at least inherit a field of memory that we come in with that definitely imprints itself and affects a lot of what we experience.
Yeah, you said a lot that I wanted to touch on. And one of the things was my favorite quote that's attributed to Einstein is the question of whether it all comes down to whether you believe the universe is friendly or not.
Mm,
Like that, it's that viewpoint about whether it's happening to you or for you. And yeah, even the difficult things in a way, not at all minimizing the trauma of them or the potential damage of them, but well, I found that I sit with people, and if it's a Pluto transit, sometimes it feels like you can encapsulate it as this is about power and teaching you about power and
mm,
to gain your own. And Uranus transits is something about liberation. And of course, right now, and then Neptune, some sort of spiritualization, and Saturn, a growing up moment. And right now in the sky, we're basically underneath, we're all working with all four of those planets working together. And maybe I know that that was one of the directions we wanted to go, was to talk about Saturn and Neptune, but maybe just I like to do the big picture. And I know that this has been part of all, in fact, I've been really loving your articles on the Saturn Neptune conjunction and Pluto and Aquarius. So maybe you could give a few minutes about like what's your perspective of the big picture that we're all working with right now with all those outer planets working together and then getting activated by eclipses and new moons, etc.
yeah.
I know it's a big topic, but and it doesn't have to be an hour, but I just like what's the theme we're working with right now?
Yeah, yeah. Before I dive into that, I did want to touch on one thing you said, which I think is really important, is the multivalency. Actually, it ties into this question, is the multivalency of astrology. And this is something that Richard Tarnas famously worked on in his book Cosmos and Psyche in his mundane astrological work, which was a huge inspiration for me and stuff that I do. And I quote and draw a lot from him. But the nature in which astrology shows up, transits show up, alignments happen on these multiple dimensions. So as you were saying with the client, it's like, we're sitting with them and just the reality of what they're going through in their life. And the beauty of astrology is at least we can offer that higher end in a way. I always find like a silver lining. There's some kernel of potentiality in everything. And if we understand that archetypal resonance, we can offer them, that kernel of like, there's this other intention as well that you can make from this. And yeah, so there's always that part of whatever we're going through, I find, even if there's always the negative too. And it's paradoxical. I think these things arrive in multiple, sometimes conflicting currents of experience of events and processes within ourselves psychologically and spiritually. So there can be a lot of layers to one singular transit. So, that question of like, what does that mean? That every astrologer gets, like, oh, my moon's in Aries, what does that mean? And, any experienced astrologer will have to kind of laugh because there isn't one answer to that question. Because that placement is manifesting on so many levels. So same as the collective transits right now, there's so many ways that they're showing up and or being reflected, or however you view astrology working. Um, I, you know, I think every period of time, thinks that they're at the brink of the apocalypse, or, I did a lecture. You can find it on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, which you can link on there, on your show notes. which is a lecture on the Aries Point. And I did a bunch of deep dive research into it, and it was interesting because I went a little bit into the history of William Lilly, who was a English astrologer during the medieval Renaissance period, that transition. And it's just interesting to read a lot of his writings. I mean, he predicted a lot of fascinating things like the London fire and and actually had some really deep insights into the monarchical shifts that were happening involving the Stuart line of kings at the time, which ended up being really pivotal because he was living at the time of the English Civil War, which actually was quite foundational to future revolutions and even the birth of America later on. Like the United States, a lot of the constitutional structure of our government came out of a lot of ideas during the English Civil War. But in his writing, he writes about this sense of like, this is the end of the world. This is the most, critical time, and just that sense of like that I think we all have our own kind of ethnocentrism about where we are and so forth. So I don't like to dive so much into that sense that like this is the most defining moment of our lives and this is the biggest step to civilization. Um, but I think at least archetypally, I think that's how it feels. And I think that's how a lot of people are experiencing it. It does feel very apocalyptic. And I have a piece I'm going to publish soon. I'm still editing it, but I was working through the sense. I was trying to touch on it phenomenologically, like how we're all kind of feeling, particularly the Neptune Saturn alignment, which is really deep and it's again has multiple layers to it. But how, and also just to touch on, like, there's every major world alignment like that. It won't necessarily seep into everyone's life in the same way. I find that if it's aspecting the chart, usually those themes come in more stronger. But like with 2020, there's those alignments of Saturn, Pluto, and Saturn, Jupiter, and of course debate over which of those alignments was the culprit of the pandemic and all of that. But that kind of event, right, that affected so much of the world. Of course, there were uncontacted tribes living in places like New Guinea and so forth that probably had no idea what was going on. And were they experiencing their own Saturn Pluto experience in their village? And, I don't know. Potentially, that would be the theory of astrology. Um, but yeah, so I think this Saturn Neptune energy, I think it is permeating in our lives all in some on some level. Uh, but to touch on the sense of which the archetype of Saturn comes through those outer planet conjunctions, like we saw with the Pluto alignment and even the Saturn Jupiter, which was really critical actually for a long time, centuries, that the Saturn Jupiter cycle, those grand conjunctions were the main means through which astrologers predicted big cultural shifts and dynastic changes and so forth. Um, so yeah, you can even explore just how powerful those alignments can be. But Tarnas touched on this in his book Cosmos. He actually, at the end of his book, he wrote about Saturn Neptune and and talked about the way that via the vehicle of Neptune and the vehicle of Pluto, that Saturn archetype expressed itself through that kind of archetypal filter. So I think we're in a both a Neptunian but also a very Saturnian time. And but also this alignment of uh, Saturn Neptune is happening on a very interesting degree of the zodiac. It's the first degree of Aries, and that was the focus of a lecture that I did. I posted on YouTube for NCGR, and I've actually done it at a few other places too, conferences, um, where I explored the symbolism of that throughout history. And it is really interesting. There does seem to be one of the biggest focus of it. I looked a lot at the um, the history of like rocket technology, computer technology, these major breakthroughs and innovations. In that talk, I start actually with Lilly and the English Civil War and the predictions he was making involving the Saturn Jupiter alignment that happened that crossed over the Aries Point. And again, so the Aries Point, anyone that doesn't know, is the first degree of Aries, and it's the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere. And so it is an astronomical point when the sun reaches that in the sky, it initiates spring and it initiates autumn in the southern hemisphere and equalizes day and night. So there is this real astronomical effect that we get from it with the sun's equatorial movement. And yeah, it's been of interest to a lot of astrologers for quite some time. It seems to be more interesting in modern times, or more of interest because of Uranian astrology and midpoint theory placed a lot of emphasis on it. That in fact, my I was studying Noel Thiele's work really early in my astrology studies, which is a bit technical stuff. But he that was when I first heard of it. And so, but yeah, if we think of that symbolism of spring and that birthing energy of the Aries point, if I'm just to kind of sum it up archetypally, it is this kind of catalyzing, birthing energy. Um, and that seems to be how a lot of astrologers have described it. Kathy Rose, I think, has a really, really interesting take on it. She calls it the bloom zone. And I really love that perspective on it. And she actually works with it, at least in an article she published through Mountain Astrologer, with solar arcs with it, which I think is interesting. So you can even use it in longer range techniques, like maybe even progressions. In fact, actually, we talked a little bit about your
No,
progression you're
no,
having, yeah, over the Aries point, which seemed to resonate too. A theme that I got from it was, and the thing about my work with it is I'm just trying to get to the most simplistic starting point. And I actually present it intentionally because I want others to build on it and work more with it. So it is a very simple statement, which is pushing boundaries. And the reason I settled on that was just because that theme, I was trying to find, is there a universal theme here? Because there's a lot of events, we're talking like rocket technology innovations and computer technology innovations and huge political uprisings and movements that happen around these Aries points alignments. And I was just like, how do I encapsulate that into a single statement that I can just kind of work with it and expand on it? And that just came through. It was sort of just like pushing boundaries. Okay, that's a starting point. But yeah, if you look at what rocket technology has done for space innovation, travel, and for weapons development and bringing civilization to the brink of potential destruction and annihilation, like nuclear developments have also had really interesting resonance with the Aries Point um, position in the sky, nuclear energy as well. So it seems like very critical things. If we even the English Civil War, it doesn't seem to be a hugely defining event for the world. It's happening in England, but England is a rising imperial power at the time
Mhm.
and does go on to shape much of the world. A lot of the countries of Europe are shaped or were shaped by the British Empire, right? And then later on, you have another series of these Aries point alignments that then mark this shift in world power from to the United States, actually. And then you get these interesting synchronicities involving nuclear energy and rocket technology and computer innovations, and even AI, even more recently. Um, the OpenAI and ChatGPT developments had interesting correspondences with eclipses on the Aries point and so forth. Um, okay, little Gemini tangent there. But to kind of put on the table that this area of the zodiac is really, I think, really powerful. And to actually note that the last time Saturn and Neptune aligned on the Aries point was actually over 2,000 years ago. So these Saturn Neptune alignments happen roughly every 36 years, but they apparently do not happen on the Aries point, or at least crossing the Aries point very often. And what's super fascinating about that time period, it was actually, I'm not sure if it was like 595 or somewhere around there. It was like around the 590s. So that transition from the 6th and 7th centuries.
That was that BCE or
BCE, yeah.
yeah, that's what I thought.
And you see basically the birth of Buddhism, the birth of Confucianism, Taoism, hugely influential worldviews and religions and philosophical currents and developments. Pre-Socratic philosophy was in its prime and developing. Zoroastrianism, which of course, is hugely influential into later Christianity and Islam and other religions. So, and that really fit a lot actually with a lot of that I was initially getting in my research on the Saturn Neptune alignments of having to do with this kind of awakening. The first article that I wrote on it was From Disillusionment to Global Awakening. And I did a presentation on that actually at a conference called Astrobash, which is an evolutionary astrology conference in Brigo. And they're actually going to have another one uh, this September, end of September. But that theme of awakening, I actually got before even really knowing that that alignment happened around that time. I actually found that out later and was like, wow, that's really interesting. That just there's these hugely influential religious, spiritual movements, philosophical movements that are going on that deeply touch on the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness. And I mean, Buddhism is just all about the mind and consciousness and you know, not directly using those terms, but essentially exploring the relationship between our own thoughts and actions and how that shapes our lives and future lives and current life and so forth. And everything is, you know, not quite what it seems. And even the pre-Socratics, I mean, pre-Socratic philosophy dove deep into this concept of like some universal mind that gave birth, you know, is emanating everything we're experiencing, and that there is these deeper layers to our reality and to our lives and to ourselves that we don't see in our waking experiences. And that there are these larger, you know, cosmic forces at work that shape things. So those were a really powerful, profound time in history, both in Eastern and Western cultures, that goes on to really shape future future ideas, and those ideas are hugely impactful and influential, and still are today. They're still affecting us and influencing us.
It's really interesting to hear you say that and put it in that way because like what I've been playing with looking at the various planetary alignments is we're looking at a revolution in not just science, but like our definition of science, right? And I think that's why like the medical field is so up and just there's so much chaos right now because I think we're on the cusp of finding a whole new way of understanding human health, for instance, well, health in general. And then I think about it, and then I think about with Pluto and Aquarius, but also Uranus and Gemini, and then of course this Aries point. And so I've been thinking about it sort of piecemeal, but I think with the way you just described it, and that sort of pushing boundaries, and if I remember right, the um the Sabian symbol for zero Aries, if you've probably looked this up too, is a woman emerging from the ocean with a seal like hanging
Mhm.
on to her leg, right? And it's that emergence and both the pushing boundaries and the emergence word to me, whenever I try to describe Aries energy to somebody for the first time, I just tell them, think about what it takes for a seedling to push up out of the soil, right? Into the air, into the
Mhm.
becoming. And it's that, to me, that has a whole feeling to it. And that's what I get when you describe this. And I think that's why, and as you say, I may be one of those people that gets, I don't think of it as doomsday, but I do think of this as a very significant period in history. Maybe not the most, right? But if when you think about what you just said about it's been 2,500 years essentially since we had this alignment at this place. I think that there's so much changing, including just how we understand who we are and who we are on so many multiple levels. And so I just find that fascinating the way you put that. It was a long way to say that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, that was beautiful. Yeah, and I definitely resonate with that Aries notion of birthing and all that birthing entails. You know, it's you know, whether it's a giraffe falling from the sky and hitting the ground, and you know, it is a kind of violent um, you know, act. It's an incredible one, right? Miraculous, but yeah, there's a lot of tension, struggle in birth and in new beginnings. And that very much I think encapsulates a lot of especially people that have a lot of Aries in their charts, kind of how they how they
Oh,
experience their life. There's a lot of struggle, it is that kind of struggle for life and for claiming life. And it just that messiness of just on that biological level that it is. I mean, there's a lot of, I think a lot of symbiosis. There's a lot of interconnectivity and a lot of things working together. But there is a level of things that involve competition and outcompeting others, and plants growing in a forest. They're all vying and reaching for light, and some outshine others, I guess you could say, or shade others out. And there is just that tension between, I guess you could say, the Libra Aries polarity, actually, right? The cooperative, symbiotic dimension, and then that struggle and vying for a place in the world, right? Um, so I think with Saturn there, Neptune there, it is a total reimagining of, I think, who we are as a species. And I mean, this has been going on a long time. It's nothing new, but just you can talk about ecological crisis and hyper-capitalism and these systems that we have right now that are so unsustainable. And
mm,
it really, I mean, you really understand them, they're comical, and these are the people that are running the world, the systems of power that are presented as the most legitimate. And this is true of the materialist worldview, and this is true of scientism, not science. But there is an ideology embedded within science known as scientism that I think is very different from actually how science operates, because science is about constantly questioning things, and not about dogma. But you'll find that within scientism, there's a lot of dogma. There's a lot of uh, zealous attack against things, astrology being a main target today, which I think is a really interesting enantiodromia from ancient times, because there were periods of time in which astrology had a lot of power and in fact was embedded and enmeshed in institutions of power. And we're in a very different place today. Astrology is heavily marginalized and very much on the fringes, and is not taken seriously by the consensus and by the bigger, broader world. And yet is a really powerful thing. If you really spend enough time with astrology, you'll find that it may not always show up, or you may not always be able to summon it in that super powerful way all the time. That's another interesting aspect of astrology, and maybe plays on that observer participation relationship quantum level of our world. But it is this hugely influential, powerful system that can tell us a lot about the future, about ourselves, about our lives. Um, and yet, anyone that's spent enough time with astrology, it's like this profound awakening, like, wow, this works. Like, I had no idea. Why isn't anybody telling me about this? Um, and yet, at the heads of state, and at least, maybe some of them are using astrology, I don't know. But, those higher echelons of power, it's a joke. Astrology is a silly thing, and of course it doesn't work, and so forth.
I
Um,
think more of them use it than admit it because there's way too many coincidences. And of course, we know it was very well used by the church and it's all over. Yeah.
yeah, or the Reagans.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of that is that, or just the synchronicity, like, because I think astrology works through synchronicity, and so we can see evidence, I think, of astrology working, and it might look like someone's using it, but who knows if it's just the synchronistic or both, a little of both. Um, so anyway, to get back to to the main point, which was like, um, there's just so much going on right now that's just hugely just unsustainable and isn't going to last. Funneling all of our wealth and resources to a handful of people who are starting genocides and wars and perpetuating violence in the world and just eating up resources is, not going to last. It's not how nature works. And I think a big part of what's going on is this, actually, because I think we're just getting over the novelty of the Enlightenment. It's like the novelty is wearing off, and that it's like it had a good run. And and this is not to, belittle astrology or science at all. I mean, science is an amazing, amazing tool that has obviously changed and transformed the world. That was a huge focus of my research with the Aries Point, is just the powerful ways that scientific innovation and scientific methodology has changed our lives and changed our reality and extended lifespans and has eased a lot of suffering. And there's a lot of, beautiful, wonderful things that science delivers. Um, but also there's a lot of terrifying, horrific things that science has delivered to us, that the myth of science that is promulgated by scientism obfuscates. It ignores that aspect of it. And it focuses on the heroic dimension of science and ignores the ways that science has been abused throughout time and history as well. And actually, the Holocaust is a really good example of that. That was a really dark time for science. There's a lot of textbooks with a lot of information that came out of, unfortunately, Nazi experiments that we learn about things. So that part of science gets ignored because it's a tool, and tools are paradoxical. And everything has a positive, miraculous, every tool has a wonderful, wonderful way that it can be used and applied, and also a really shady underbelly and potentiality for destruction. So, and science, uh, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution definitely taps into that Promethean archetype, I think, delivering fire to humanity and defying the gods. And that whole myth is definitely playing out. There's also a lot of, I guess you could say, Zoroastrianism and Christianity and this battle of good and evil also playing out in Western consciousness generally, because that's such a hugely influential mythos of Western culture that makes its way in science. Um, so, but I think a lot of what's happening too is that novelty of what science can do. It's still amazing, but it's kind of wearing off. And I think we're realizing that there's actually a lot more that maybe even ancient people knew that um, that we can now verify or at least better understand through science. And I think it's bringing these ancient perspectives and ancient insights and weaving them together with modern innovations and modern technology and maybe AI and all of these things that are happening. And same with AI. AI it's an incredible tool. I use it a lot for many, many things. It also has a lot of shortcomings. There's a lot of things that it doesn't do well, and we probably shouldn't be using it for. And there's a lot of ways that AI and this tapping into Pluto Aquarius, which I won't super, dive into right now, but there's definitely a dark side, a shady side to AI that we will be encountering, I think, very in a compressed way over the next 20 years, so to say. Um, but right, that I mean, what an incredible innovation. I don't think we fully grasp like what and technically we're not really at AI, we're at machine learning and large language models technically. Um, and but just the way that we can amass so much information and we can come to certain conclusions and we can get insights into things at a much faster pace, I think will accelerate a lot of processes and will get us there, faster. Um, but yeah, I think AI is a huge part of it. I do think artificial intelligence, large language models will be a big part of this transition we're experiencing and shaping the world. Um, but I also think there is this awakening to consciousness and the nature of reality um, that science can't actually address.
At least not yet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to put it bluntly, it's like, a science gives us a lot of ways that we can manipulate our world in really cool ways. Um, but that doesn't actually give us the ability to deeply understand the nature of reality, even though the myth of science claims people really believe that it does. There's tons of science pundits out there, thinking, and I think they genuinely believe that they can actually get a genuine metaphysical understanding of reality or ontological understanding of reality through science. And so far, that has not been delivered. And um, I think we're on the brink of that right now. And I think we're awakening to a whole new way of looking at ourselves, looking at reality, our relationship to the planet and the broader universe. Um, that I think when that really settles in, will be really profound for our civilization because the way we're living now is a lot of people are living without this awareness. It's very clear in their actions, the way that things are just so deeply exploited, and there really doesn't seem to be much sense of sacredness around the world we live in, the planet we live on. And step outside and just go into a forest, and just the incredible complexity and beauty and wisdom that's there. So much of the modern world, at least, doesn't see that. And that's kind of scary, I think, that people don't see that miraculous beauty in nature that gave birth to us, and that this is our home, at least for now. And um, so, to put it in a nutshell, I think a big part of what's happening too is this awakening to, um, where we actually are, what we're actually a part of, that interconnectivity.
Well, and I think you haven't said it exactly in those words, but you say it a little bit in your bio. I mean, and there's no good language for this, but we're talking about the understanding of spirit, the spirituality of it all, right? Not, I mean, whatever you believe, whether you believe in God or whether you have, whether it's Christian or whatever, it seems like the limitation that you're talking about in science and everything else, and the Enlightenment itself was that we separated the idea of the material and the sacred, the material and the spiritual. And I hear a lot of people talking about it in terms of consciousness, but that's not the same thing, right? Consciousness is not the same as soul, even though I think there's a relationship. So that it's interesting. I mean, I think that's what you're talking about, what you're describing, but maybe we just don't have words for it because my personal thought is that until we recognize, as you say, the sacredness, but see it in a way that like it's bigger than us, right? It's bigger than, and the whole is bigger than the parts. And that's part of what the problem is with science, right? It reduces things to parts instead of understanding that that's not how life works. I read something, I read a couple of articles not too long ago when I was researching for one of my classes. It says scientists still can't agree on a definition of life. And to
Mm.
me, that sort of sums it all up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was even, debates over whether is a virus, a life form. Um, yes, it is, but it's yeah, and I think just um yeah, we're just new on the scene. Like if you really understand the evolution of this planet, which is pretty long, it's the evolution of any planet is, like 10 million years in planetary terms is a blink of an eye, really. So, humans are, I think we inherit the memory. I think we inherit, and that's just biologically true of evolution, that we're building upon and passing the genes forward and allele frequencies forward. Um, but yeah, we're pretty new on the planet as a species. And so this moment we're in is from the Earth's perspective, really not a long time. It's and not very impactful, actually.
Right. Yeah.
Again, not to belittle, not to minimize the ecological destruction and all the things that we are doing that will mostly harm us. And yes, they harm other species and other life forms, of course. But from the Earth's broader perspective, right? She's seen a lot. She's been through a lot. Um, so, uh, so yeah, I think, and actually to go to the nature of consciousness, because and I think this is actually I mean, this is what a lot of what Buddhism and these ideas that came through at that period of the 6th century, um, really touched on that, actually, that very question. They weren't calling it consciousness, but essentially, is mind everything? And that not mind in terms of like our thoughts, but just is our experience that we're having, you know, is it um is it all one unified thing, right? So
Right.
then consciousness gets into that question, which I don't claim to have answers for, but you could say like a lot of these ancient philosophers and however they arrived at their perceptions of reality through meditation or through altered states of consciousness or psychedelics or whatever it was, probably a variety of those things. they peered into something I think that was true, which is that everything is ultimately interconnected, which means that our experience that we're having, our own subjectivity is embedded in that. Our own phenomenological experience is embedded in nature. It's a part of nature, right? So we're not separate, even though, yes, we're new on the scene as a species, but we are embedded in this larger web of consciousness. And so reality may be, and I don't know if that's ultimately true. There's philosophical debates over this. Specifically, idealism would say that everything is consciousness, everything is just mind. And this is what, pre-Socratics were kind of basically saying, kind of what the Buddha was saying, that um, it is one kind of illusion, grand illusion. And but also that awareness, I think, brings us I think it makes our reality, it gives us more sense of responsibility and respect for our reality because we are way more deeply embedded into it than I think we think of ourselves. And what the materialist worldview has presented for us is that we're just these, isolated things, these bodies, right, that exist in this actual physical world, even though we might not see it exactly the way that it is, but it's there. And we have these brains, and this is where our thoughts come from, and this is what's generating our experience of consciousness. Um, and so if that's the case, if we're just these little bodies walking around this physical space and that's it, and we die and decay and our consciousness ceases to be, um, then who cares? I think that is on an unconscious level, breeding a lot of what's happening in the world. It's just this like, just come in and trash the place and take what you want and move on, right? But these ancient philosophies are saying, no, 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 your participation in this place, whatever it is actually really important and it has consequences, not just for everyone around you and everything around you, but for yourself and and whatever that is, soul, a memory field, a morphogenetic field. I don't know what it is, but I do think that we have a self that is more than just our ego self, our waking self.
Right.
There's more to Chad than Chad.
Right.
And I extend, and I've had this experience in dreams, I've had this experience on psychedelics several times of just genuinely experiencing not just the experience, but a knowing, like a genuine knowing that, oh yeah, of course, I am way more than this, and extending way beyond what I think is myself. In fact, that other dimension of myself, I've had experiences of that actually being way more important than this experience I'm at right now. Like this is like kind of like a silly moment, a little experience that I'm having, but this larger process that I am actually a part of was actually way more than what I am. And I think we can peer into that as well with astrology. We can actually see these archetypal currents playing out in our lives as um, going on beyond, even beyond our own single life. There's this larger process that we're embedded into, if that makes sense. Hopefully that
Oh,
was too tangential.
oh, I think I was thinking this is a very Neptunian conversation. I mean, I think we're
Yes.
really I mean, we're not saying it that way, but what you're talking about is this is how Neptune operates, especially at that zero Aries point, which is where it is right now, is that sort of awakening and opening to this other way of seeing things and understanding our experience of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and pushing the boundaries of what we think reality is. I think that's a huge theme of this alignment. And I don't think it's all gonna, or I don't think the whole world's gonna be aware of that as it's happening,
Right.
but that's happening. And I think there's a lot of events taking place right now, world events, just so many layers to it that will eventually reveal that for us, that will point us in that direction, that like the boundaries of what we think reality is are going to shift. And I think that's terrifying, actually, right? Like that's terrifying for our species, for all of us, even those of us that entertain and question things, entertain other ideas and question things and delve into this stuff. It is kind of terrifying to think of those things. I think reincarnation is terrifying, actually. I don't find it comforting at all. I used to think it was a fun idea when I was younger. And then, once you get old enough in your life, you're like, wow, life can really suck. And some really horrific things can happen to you. And I'm gonna, experience this for thousands of more times. And or just that experience and good and bad, it can just continue for eternity. I mean, that's terrifying, right? Um, so yeah, just I think I think the implications of questioning the current dogmatic narrative are huge, and
Mhm.
when that actually settles in, will be the radical change. But I think with any of these alignments, it takes time for the consequences of the things that happen around them to really set in and to impact the world and society. I mean, just think of 2020. There's so many things that I think unfolded at that time involving power and government and
Yep.
science and all a lot of things going on there that I don't think we've fully grasped yet collectively. I don't think that's really the lessons of that. I don't think have fully settled in, but they will. They will settle in, and in history, we'll look back on many things that have been happening currently and look at them very differently. Many events that are happening in the world or have happened, I think, will be looked at a very different light and reconceptualized and understood as being hugely consequential and, yeah, will be very powerful teaching moments for humanity.
So I'm thinking that even though this is the kind of conversation I'd love to have longer, we probably should wrap. But what the question I'd like to ask you, since you do counseling sessions for individuals, like what's your like if you're thinking about talking to a person with all of this that we just went through and kind of the flavor of the time we're living in, what's your counsel to people, to individuals, in terms of how they navigate through such wild times that feel so epic?
Yeah. So in the piece that I'm working on right now, I'm exploring the the nature of Saturn and Neptune, but particularly Saturn and how it connects into developmental processes. And in fact, that's one of the most interesting ways to track Saturn is and even those those points of its cycle that we all go through at similar times, the Saturn return, or even like around 14, that first Saturn, the Saturn squares, oppositions, returns. There are these really critical biological changes that happen, puberty, a big one, you know, just the total transformation that happens from adolescence into your teenage years, and the the excitement and the the fun possibilities that opens up, but also the burden of that experience. And then we get into midlife, and the true end of adolescence and coming into our adulthood and claiming the responsibility of being an autonomous being and having a role in the world and what that role is and what that implies for our community and for our society, and surviving and making our way, and for women specifically menopause, right? That's a hugely transformative process that is, and while it's happening, the liminal stage of those processes while they're happening, they kind of suck,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're painful. You could use that metaphor of giving birth or, gestating something, but it's like while you're in that process, it isn't comfortable, and I think Saturn transits, and we talked about this too in our session, they're not always bad, right? They're not always these enormously painful times necessarily. But I do find that they always confront us with the need to grow into something new, and we've outgrown something. And there is always some level of burden and new responsibility that we gain at those times that is challenging. And we can willingly participate more with that. We can become really conscious of what's happening and engage that and really tackle it, take on some bigger step. So, but often with Saturn, we're leveling up, we're coming into a new level of growth. And before that period and while we're in that period of growth, we have no idea really. Anyone could tell us like, oh, this is what it's like, and we could read biographies and stories and narratives about it, but we will never truly know, what it's like to be on the other side of those transformations until we get there. And
Yeah.
I think that's a huge, I just find a helpful piece to help guide people through these types of processes, whether that's other cycles they're going through, Pluto transits can feel like that. And, a lot of these outer planet transits that people go through that are really long, can last years of their life, can feel like that. And it's hard as an astrologer to be like, well, it looks like things are going to
Feel-
suck for a while. But on the other side, in a few years from now, you'll be in this whole other place, and you'll have your wings, and you'll have a grasp of the wheel, and you'll feel stable. And so, what I was exploring in this article is just the way in which once we get there, right, we adapt, we adjust. It becomes the new normal, and it's just normal. It's totally natural. And the process itself is natural. I think what's happening collectively, this is all natural. This is all ancient embedded processes um, that we know how to get through it. We know how to manage it, no matter how complex it seems. I think even our technological stuff that's going on that seems hyper novel and it's something that, at least from our knowledge, humanity has not experienced yet, is still natural. It's a part of nature, right? And it's drawing from these deeper archetypal realms, and it is drawing forth from ancient knowledge. So, um, so yeah, that's kind of how I, I like to frame it as a liminal stage. And I'm seeing this a lot in clients that have particularly this alignment going on. It's like they're in this kind of liminal, some of them a crucible of sorts. Um, and the thing with Neptune is it's such an ambiguous archetype. You
So
know,
nebulous.
yeah, it touches on this realm of reality that actually I think is more true than the Saturnian one. If you explore these ideas of consciousness and the nature of reality, the Saturnian reality, yes, is consequential. I'm in a body, and if I fall off a ledge, I'm going to fall and hurt myself. And there's these, laws of the world that we have to obey and that we can't change. The sun's going to rise tomorrow and set, and there's these cycles that are embedded, and that is true. But all those things will change, right? The universe, the solar system, like whatever is going on right now, will eventually transform into something else. Um, so it's not permanent, right? And a lot of Saturn is actually cultural. It's a lot of what society, right? It's like, it's just true enough. It works. It gets us through the day. This is, what you need to know to get by. Um, but yeah, actually and again, like our own conception of reality, the worldviews that we're a part of, like those will eventually change. How we understand ourselves and everything will eventually evolve into something else. But Neptune, I do think the archetype, it touches on this more, I don't want to say eternal necessarily, but a more kind of broader, deeper, more consistent part of our reality and ourselves. And that gets into the transpersonal and kind of what I was talking about earlier, and we can touch on this at times, but in our own waking, sober consciousness, unless we're like a highly gifted medium with that burden and gift, and we're just, talking to the dead all the time or whatever. Most of us, right? We're not embedded in that Neptunian realm. We only glimpse it every now and then, or we get intuitions and nudges and senses of it. But we can never know it fully. We can never really grasp and understand it. So that's what's so frustrating about about Neptunian experiences is it's like they present us with this bigger thing that we know is there and we know is real, but while in our body, at least in our waking state, we can't fully know it. So that's what I think we're coming into as a species, as a civilization. We're coming into that edge of that, and we're in this liminal stage. And I have no idea actually what's on the other end. But I
Right.
do think it will deeply affect the nature of reality. It will deeply affect structures of power and hierarchy. There will be huge consequences from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I have like 2 pages of notes about this, about our conversation. This is great. Well, thank you, Chad. Like I say, we could go longer, but and I'm looking forward to when do you know when your next piece will be published?
Hopefully soon. Yeah, my sometimes I can just write things very quickly. This is not a research-based piece, so those take way longer. This is more of a fluid kind of creative writing and touching on more of the subjective phenomenological aspect of this alignment. So it's pretty brief. It's like a little bit over 1,000 words. But yeah, I should have it edited, I think within the next, at least probably by next week.
Okay.
So we'll
Yeah,
see.
I'll definitely put your newsletter link at your Substack and your website, and then I definitely encourage people to sign up because you do new and full moon newsletters, right? Every month. And I always love that you pull tarot cards and tie those in as well to your essays. And so it's just another way to kind of keep up with what's going on and have that deeper understanding. So yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was fun.
Yeah, it was great talking with you.
Yeah, this is it's such an interesting time, and it's really I appreciate having your breadth and depth about it because it does put it in a larger context, and I think that's super helpful right now for all of us.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate being invited on and really enjoyed connecting with you.
Yeah. Well, me too. Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you for listening to the Natural Wisdom podcast and being part of this community. And we talked a lot about natural wisdom today, so that felt good for me as well. Appreciate that. And we'll see you all in the next couple weeks again. So thank you. And thanks again, Chad.
Yeah, thank you.